It's a known pattern that therapists, psychologists, and even university professors cherry-pick Carl Jung's opinions to their liking. Unlike most people, Jung did not care about being liked or conforming to the crowd. Carl Jung maintained a lifelong, serious, and scholarly interest in the occult, viewing it not as mere superstition, but as a crucial expression of the human unconscious, archetypes, and the collective psyche. And many believe, including me, that the mainstream modern psychology is still far behind Jung's ideas. I'm going to tell you something that contradicts almost everything you've read about avoidant attachment, something that the self-help industry won't tell you because it destroys the product they're selling, something that therapists resist acknowledging because it challenges the foundational assumption their entire profession is built on. Some people cannot change, not won't, not haven't yet, cannot. And the avoidant in your life, the one you've been patient with, the one you've been waiting for, the one you've been hoping will finally do enough therapy or gain enough insight or feel safe enough to become emotionally available, maybe one of them. Carl Jung understood this. He wrote about it extensively in ways that modern psychology has quietly minimized because acknowledging what Jung actually observed would require therapists to admit something professionally devastating, that for certain people, the defensive structure isn't something they have, it's something they are. And you cannot therapy someone into being a different person. You cannot love them into it. You cannot create conditions safe enough for transformation that their psychology structurally does not permit. This video is going to walk you through exactly what Jung observed, why it applies so precisely to avoidant psychology, why therapists resist it, and what it means for you specifically, the person who has been loving someone whose patterns may be permanent features of who they are, rather than temporary obstacles on the way to who they could become. Stay with me, because this is uncomfortable, and it's also the most liberating thing you're going to hear. The idea that changes everything. Before we get into Jung specifically, I need to give you the central idea clearly, because everything else in this video builds on it, and I don't want you to miss it. There is a difference between someone who has defenses and someone who is their defenses. Most people who struggle with intimacy, vulnerability, or emotional availability have defenses, protective patterns that developed in response to painful experiences and that interfere with genuine connection. These people can change. With the right therapeutic support, with consistent safe experience, with genuine motivation and sustained effort, the defenses can be understood, can be loosened, can be gradually replaced with new patterns that allow for healthier relating. This is what therapy is designed for, and what therapy can genuinely produce. The optimistic therapeutic assumption that change is possible is accurate for these people. But Jung identified another category. People for whom the defense didn't develop on top of an authentic self. It developed instead of one. People whose entire psychological organization was structured around the defense so early and so completely that the defense became the architecture of everything. There's no authentic, emotionally available self waiting underneath the avoidance patterns. The patterns are the self. The withdrawal is the self. The emotional unavailability is not something covering who they really are. It is who they really are at the most fundamental level of their psychological organization. For these people, the therapeutic assumption that change is possible isn't just overly optimistic. It's wrong in a way that causes real harm to the person being told they can change if they just work hard enough, and to everyone who loves them and waits for a transformation that the person's psychology will never permit. This is Jung's warning, and it's the warning that makes therapists deeply uncomfortable, because accepting it requires accepting something the therapeutic profession is not built to accept. Jung was actually talking about. Jung didn't use the term avoidant attachment. That framework came later, through Bowlby and Ainsworth. But what Jung wrote about certain psychological types and permanent defensive structures maps onto avoidant psychology with a precision that is either remarkable coincidence or evidence that Jung was observing something real about a particular kind of human psychological organization. Jung wrote extensively about the persona, the social mask we construct to navigate the world. For most people, Jung observed, there's a living tension between the persona and what he called the self, the deeper, fuller, more authentic version of who we are beneath the role we play in public. Most people's persona is genuinely a mask. Underneath it, there's someone more vulnerable, more complex, more emotionally alive than what the outside world sees. The therapeutic project for most people is helping them live in closer alignment with that deeper self, helping them be more authentic, more vulnerable, more genuinely present, rather than perpetually performing the persona. But Jung observed that certain individuals developed something different, not a persona covering an authentic self, a persona that had become the totality of their psychological existence. The mask, put on so early, worn so continuously, constructed so completely that it didn't cover anything. It replaced everything. For these individuals, attempting to remove the persona doesn't reveal the authentic self. It creates void, terrifying, destabilizing, identity annihilating void, because there's nothing underneath to be revealed. Now map this onto avoidant attachment. The avoidant child, in response to caregivers who were emotionally unavailable or rejecting, did what all children do. They adapted. They constructed a self that could survive in the environment they were given, an independent self, a self-sufficient self, a self that doesn't need, doesn't depend, doesn't reach for connection, because reaching for connection in their early environment resulted in pain or rejection or the specific agony of a need extended towards someone who couldn't meet it. This construction was adaptive. It was necessary. It allowed the child to survive an environment that couldn't meet their emotional needs without being continuously destroyed by the gap between what they needed and what they received. The question that determines everything about whether change is possible, is how early this construction happened, how completely it replaced, rather than covered the authentic developing self, and whether anything remained beneath it that therapy could potentially access and develop. Jung's warning is that for a specific subset of people, the construction happened early enough and completely enough that the answer is no. Nothing remained. The defensive, self-sufficient persona is the whole thing, and attempting to dismantle it doesn't liberate anyone. It threatens the only version of personhood the individual has ever known. Why the avoidance nervous system experiences change as death. This is the part that most explanations of avoidance psychology miss. And missing it is why so many people spend years waiting for change that never arrives. When we talk about someone being resistant to change, we usually mean they're choosing not to change, that they're comfortable or afraid, or haven't been sufficiently motivated. And the implied solution is always the same: create more motivation, more safety, more insight. Eventually, the person will choose differently. But what Jung identified in permanent defensive structures isn't resistance to change in this sense. It's something more fundamental. The avoidance nervous system doesn't experience therapeutic change as growth. It experiences it as annihilation. Think about what genuine therapeutic transformation would require for someone whose entire identity is organized around self-sufficiency and emotional unavailability. It would require them to acknowledge profound need they've spent their entire life constructing a self around not having. It would require them to become vulnerable in ways that their psychological architecture treats as the most dangerous thing available. It would require them to depend, to reach, to be emotionally present with another person. All things that their nervous system has been encoding as threat since before they had language to understand what threat meant. This isn't discomfort. This is what Jung called psychological death, the dissolution of the only self they've ever known, the annihilation of the identity structure that has been protecting them since childhood. And the human psyche, any human psyche, responds to psychological death with the same desperate intensity that the human body responds to physical death, with everything it has, with every defense available. This is why the avoidant who genuinely enters therapy, who seems genuinely motivated, who appears to be doing genuine work, often shows no meaningful change in their actual patterns despite years of therapeutic engagement. They're not being lazy or dishonest or insufficiently committed. Their psyche is doing exactly what any psyche does when its existence is threatened. It's protecting itself. It's allowing the intellectual engagement because intellectual engagement is safe, costs nothing, doesn't require actually changing, while fortifying every wall against the emotional experience that would constitute real transformation. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly. He called it one of the most consistent and most difficult phenomena in psychological work. The person who demonstrates sophisticated understanding of their patterns while remaining completely defended against the experience that would actually shift them. And he was honest about what it meant. For certain individuals, this isn't a phase of therapy. It's the ceiling of therapy. The intellectual engagement is as far as their psychology will permit them to go. The specific way therapists get fooled and why they can't admit it. Here's where Jung's warning gets most uncomfortable for the therapeutic profession and most clarifying for you. The avoidant who enters therapy is often extraordinarily good at appearing to do therapeutic work. This isn't conscious manipulation usually. It's the same adaptive intelligence that constructed the persona in the first place, an acute sensitivity to what the environment requires, and the ability to provide it. In a therapeutic environment, what's required is insight, self-reflection, emotional vocabulary, willingness to examine patterns. The avoidant can provide all of these, fluently, sometimes brilliantly. They learn the language of attachment theory and speak it accurately. They can describe their childhood experiences with appropriate emotional tone. They can identify their patterns with impressive specificity. They can articulate, in moving and precise terms, exactly how their avoidance affects their relationships. They give the therapist what therapists are trained to recognize as signs of productive therapeutic engagement. But Jung would look at this and ask a different question than most therapists ask. Not, is the client engaging with the content, but is the engagement producing any change in the actual patterns? And in many cases, in more cases than the therapeutic profession is comfortable acknowledging, the answer is no. The patterns are identical. The emotional unavailability is unchanged. The withdrawal functions exactly as it always has. The capacity for genuine, sustained intimacy hasn't developed. The only thing that's changed is the client's ability to explain their patterns with greater sophistication. And this, Jung warned, is potentially worse than no therapy at all, because now the avoidant has something they didn't have before: psychological vocabulary they can use to defend their patterns more effectively. When their partner confronts their withdrawal, they don't get defensive in crude ways that are easy to identify and challenge. They calmly explain their attachment style. They reference their childhood wounding. They demonstrate impressive self-awareness about why they do what they do, while continuing to do it completely unchanged. The sophistication of the explanation makes the pattern harder to confront, harder to hold them accountable for, harder to challenge, because every challenge can be met with what sounds like genuine self-awareness, but functions as more elegant defense. Jung also identified something even more uncomfortable. The therapist's own need to believe therapy is working can become complicit in the performance of therapeutic progress, rather than the reality of it. The therapist needs to believe their work is effective. Professional identity depends on it. When a client demonstrates apparent insight and apparent engagement, the training-conditioned response is to interpret this as evidence that therapy is working. The client reports an insight. The therapist validates and interprets it as growth. The client learns what produces positive response from the therapist and provides more of it. Both parties collaborate, often completely unconsciously, in maintaining a narrative of progress. Meanwhile, the actual patterns, the behaviors in relationships, the capacity for genuine vulnerability, the ability to sustain emotional presence with another person, remain completely unchanged. Jung warned that therapists must develop what he called ruthless honesty about whether actual transformation is occurring or whether elaborate performance of therapeutic work is happening while the core structure remains defended. Most therapists, he observed, cannot maintain this honesty because it threatens both their professional identity and their relationship with the client. Acknowledging that therapy isn't working means acknowledging limitations that the therapeutic profession is built to deny. This doesn't mean therapy is useless for avoidance universally. It means therapy with avoidance whose defensive structure is their identity, rather than something covering their identity, may produce sophisticated clients who can discuss their patterns brilliantly while remaining entirely incapable of changing them. The individuation ceiling. Why some people can't complete the journey. Jung's concept of individuation is central to understanding why some avoidants can genuinely change and others cannot. And understanding the difference helps you assess the specific person in your life with more accuracy than generic optimism allows. Individuation was Jung's term for the process of psychological maturation, becoming whole by confronting and integrating all aspects of the self, including the parts that have been denied, repressed, or buried. For most people, this process is difficult but possible. It requires courage, specifically the courage to face what Jung called the shadow, all the aspects of self that have been rejected. For the avoidant, the shadow contains everything their defensive structure was built to deny: the profound need for connection, the vulnerability, the dependency, the grief of the original wound, the terror of reaching for something and having it not be there. Genuine individuation for an avoidant would require them to descend into that material, to feel, with full intensity, the original pain their defensive structure was constructed to protect them from, to sit with the child they were, the child who needed connection and didn't receive it, whose reaching was met with absence or rejection or inconsistency, and integrate that experience rather than continuing to organize their entire personality around escaping it. Jung was honest about how rare this is. He observed that when people encounter their shadow material, when the therapeutic or life process brings them to the edge of the original wound, the majority turn away. Not because they're cowardly in a simple sense, because what's being asked of them is genuinely enormous. To feel what the defense was built to prevent feeling, to become vulnerable to the original pain in order to move through it, to temporarily dissolve the self-sufficient identity in order to reconstitute on the other side as someone capable of genuine connection. Most people, Jung observed, choose their known suffering over this dissolution, and he accepted this choice. He didn't pathologize it or treat it as failure. He recognized it as a real human response to real psychological danger, the choice to maintain the familiar, however limiting, over the unknown, however potentially liberating. For avoidants specifically, this choice presents in a particular way. They often know, intellectually, that their patterns are limiting them. They can articulate the cost. They can describe what they're missing. They might genuinely want to be different. But when the therapeutic or relational process actually brings them to the edge of the wound, when genuine vulnerability is actually required rather than discussed, they retreat. Every time. Automatically. With a consistency that has nothing to do with conscious choice and everything to do with what their nervous system will and won't tolerate. This retreat isn't weakness. It's the predictable response of a psychological system that was organized around protection from exactly this experience. And for certain individuals whose organization is complete enough, whose defensive structure is thorough enough, the retreat will happen every time. The individuation ceiling is real, and no amount of therapeutic skill or partner patience raises it. What stays constant while everything else changes? Here is the specific test that Jung's framework suggests, not as clinical diagnostic tool, but as honest assessment that helps you see clearly. Watch behavior under pressure. Not behavior in calm periods, not behavior when things are good, behavior specifically when intimacy deepens, when vulnerability is actually required, when the relationship reaches the point where genuine emotional presence is no longer optional. For someone whose defensive structure is modifiable, someone for whom genuine change is possible, what you'll see under pressure is struggle followed by effort. They'll feel the pull to withdraw. They'll feel the anxiety of genuine intimacy, and they'll work against it, imperfectly, inconsistently, with setbacks, but with a direction that's genuinely toward you, toward the relationship, toward developing capacity, even though developing it is uncomfortable. For someone whose defensive structure is their identity, someone for whom change is structurally limited, what you'll see under pressure is the same pattern, always. The withdrawal when closeness deepens, the shutdown when vulnerability is required, the retreat when the relationship reaches a depth their psychology cannot tolerate, and crucially, no sustained movement against this. Individual moments of openness, perhaps, periods of apparent warmth that create hope. But when pressure arrives, when genuine intimacy is actually required, the pattern returns, unchanged, with a consistency that isn't about will or motivation, but about psychological structure operating exactly as it was built to operate. Years passing doesn't change this. Therapy doesn't change this. Your patience doesn't change this. Your love doesn't change this. Because what's operating isn't a behavior that can be modified. It's an identity that's protecting its own existence. This is the observation Jung made that therapists resist most, not because it's inaccurate, but because it requires acknowledging that effort and motivation and therapeutic skill have limits, that some things in human psychology are structural rather than behavioral, and that some people are organized in ways that make certain kinds of growth not just difficult, but impossible in the ways that matter for intimate relationship. The harm in false hope. What waiting actually costs. This is the part of Jung's warning that's most directly relevant to you. The person watching this, the person who has been loving and avoidant and waiting and hoping and adjusting and trying to create conditions where change becomes possible. False hope has a specific cost that doesn't get named clearly enough. It's not just that you're disappointed when the change doesn't arrive. It's that while you're waiting for change that isn't coming, you're making real decisions with real consequences based on a future that doesn't exist. You're staying in a relationship that cannot become what you need it to be, not temporarily, permanently. You're organizing your life, your hopes, your emotional investment around the potential of a person rather than the reality. You're doing the enormous psychological work of maintaining hope against accumulating evidence. evidence that any honest assessment would read as conclusive, but that false hope keeps reframing as not quite enough to act on. And the specific cruelty of this is that the evidence never stops accumulating. There's always enough apparent progress to maintain hope, enough moments of warmth, enough vulnerability in isolated conversations, enough apparent insight in how they discuss their patterns, just enough that leaving feels like giving up on something that was almost there, just enough that staying feels like it might finally be rewarded. This is not accident. Jung observed that defensive structures, particularly sophisticated ones, are often capable of producing exactly as much apparent progress as needed to prevent the consequences that would arise from no progress at all. Not through conscious calculation, through the automatic operation of a system that has learned very early how to provide just enough to maintain access to connection while protecting against the genuine vulnerability that real connection requires. You're not imagining the moments of warmth, they're real. You're not imagining the apparent progress. It's real enough. What you're misinterpreting is what those moments mean, whether they represent genuine transformation underway, or whether they represent the maximum output of a psychological system that cannot go further. Jung's framework helps you ask that question with more precision than optimism allows. Why this is liberation and not hopelessness? I want to be precise about this because it matters. Jung's warning isn't that avoidants are broken or bad or unworthy of love. It's that certain psychological organizations have structural limits that exist regardless of what anyone does, including the avoidant themselves. The avoidant with a permanent defensive structure isn't choosing to be incapable of genuine intimacy. They're not withholding transformation to punish you. They are organized in a way that makes transformation of this specific kind structurally unavailable to them. That's not moral failure. It's psychological reality. But here's what this reality means for you. You are released from the impossible task. You have been trying to create conditions where someone changes who cannot change in the ways you need them to. You have been patient in service of potential that doesn't exist. You have been adjusting, accommodating, hoping, interpreting, reinterpreting, doing all the enormous work of maintaining a relationship with someone who cannot meet you in the ways relationship requires. And you've been doing this while believing, on some level, that the right combination of your love and their therapy and time would eventually produce the transformation, that you were in a temporary situation on the way to a permanent improvement. Jung's framework releases you from that belief, not cruelly, clearly, with the specific kindness that only accurate information provides, the kindness of knowing what you're actually working with, so you can make real decisions rather than decisions based on projected possibility. You are not failing by acknowledging limits. You are not giving up by accepting that transformation isn't coming. You are not abandoning someone by recognizing that what they need in order to be capable of genuine intimacy is something neither your love nor their therapy can provide. You are seeing clearly, and seeing clearly is the beginning of every real decision you will ever make. The relationship you deserve, the one with genuine emotional availability, genuine vulnerability, genuine sustained presence, is not available from someone whose psychological structure has no room for it. Waiting longer doesn't change this. Loving better doesn't change this. Being more patient doesn't change this. What changes it is you deciding to stop waiting and start moving toward a life and a relationship that is built on what's actually available rather than on what might theoretically become available if the right conditions were ever met. What Jung actually gives you. Let me be precise about what Jung's framework provides that generic relationship advice doesn't. It gives you permission to trust your own observations. You have watched this person across significant time. You have observed their patterns under varying conditions. You have seen what happens when intimacy deepens, when vulnerability is required, when the relationship reaches the places where genuine emotional presence is necessary. You have accumulated more data about this specific person's capacity than any therapist who sees them for 50 minutes a week. Jung's framework validates your observations rather than dismissing them as insufficient patience or insufficient understanding or insufficient safety creation. It gives you a way to distinguish between someone who is struggling to change and someone who cannot change in the ways you need. These look similar from the outside and feel similar in the relationship. Both involve patterns, both involve frustration, both involve moments of hope followed by disappointment. But they're fundamentally different situations with fundamentally different, appropriate responses. Someone struggling to change deserves patience and support, and the time that genuine transformation requires. Someone who cannot change in the ways partnership requires deserves your honest acknowledgement of that limit, which ultimately means releasing them from a relationship they cannot fulfill and releasing yourself from a weight that has no end. It gives you clarity about what therapy can and cannot do. Therapy is genuinely valuable for many people with avoidant patterns, those for whom the defensive structure covers rather than constitutes their identity. For those people, therapy can be genuinely transformative. But for those in the category Jung identified, those for whom the defense is the self, therapy is likely to produce sophisticated self-understanding without behavioral change. Knowing this helps you assess whether the therapy your partner is doing is producing actual changes in their patterns over time, or whether it's producing a more articulate explanation of why their patterns exist while the patterns themselves remain completely intact. And it gives you permission to make decisions based on present reality rather than future potential. The person in front of you right now, who they are, what they're capable of, what they can actually offer in intimate partnership. This is the relevant information. Not who they might become, not the potential you can see in them that their patterns are preventing, not the version of them that exists in your hope, the actual person demonstrating their actual capacity in the actual present. If that person's actual present capacity is insufficient for what you need from partnership, you're allowed to leave. Not after more time, not after more therapy, not after you've given every possible configuration of patience and support. Now, based on what's actually in front of you. The final thing Jung's warning offers. There's one more thing worth naming before we close, something that doesn't get said enough to people who have been loving avoidance for significant time. Your failure to help them change was not your failure. Read that again. You tried. You understood. You created safety. You communicated clearly. You were patient beyond what patience usually asks. You adjusted your needs, your timing, your approach. You read the books and learn the frameworks and tried to create conditions where change could occur. And it didn't work. And somewhere in you, there may be a story that your failure to help them change means something about your inadequacy, that if you'd been different, more patient, less anxious, more understanding, better at creating safety, the outcome would have been different. Jung's framework says directly, no, you were attempting to help someone change whose psychological structure does not permit the change you were working toward. You were trying to create conditions for transformation in someone for whom transformation of this kind is structurally unavailable. You failed not because you were insufficient, but because what you were attempting cannot be done, not by you, not by a better version of you, not by a perfect partner, not by the world's most skilled therapist. The attempting was not the mistake. The attempting was love. The mistake, if it can even be called that, was believing that enough of the right kind of love would be sufficient to produce something that love alone cannot produce, and that therapy often cannot produce either. That belief was false hope, and false hope wasn't your flaw. It was what you were given in place of accurate information. This is the accurate information. Some people's defensive structures are permanent. Some patterns are who someone is rather than something someone has. Some relationships cannot become what they need to become regardless of what either person does. This is not tragic in the dramatic sense. It's simply true. And truth, however uncomfortable, is always more useful than hope that prevents you from seeing clearly. You deserved to know this earlier. You deserved accurate assessment of what you were working with, rather than endless optimistic encouragement to keep trying. You deserve to make real decisions with real information, rather than decisions based on a future that was never coming. You have that information now. What you do with it is yours entirely. But whatever you do it with the clarity that accurate information provides, not with the guilt of someone who gave up, not with the confusion of someone who never understood what they were dealing with the clear eyes of someone who finally has the full picture and is finally free to choose accordingly. Jung warned about permanent defensive structures because he believed people deserve the truth about what they were dealing with, not comfortable lies in service of hope, truth in service of real decisions. This is that truth. Truth, as Jung knew better than almost anyone, is always where real liberation begins. And I want to stay with that word, liberation, because I think it's important to be specific about what liberation actually feels like when it arrives through this particular door. Because it doesn't feel the way we expect liberation to feel. We expect liberation to feel like relief, like a weightlifting, like the sudden lightness of a burden set down. And sometimes it does feel like that, but usually not immediately. Usually not at first. What liberation through accurate information feels like, initially, is grief. Real grief. The specific, heavy, disorienting grief of having a hope dismantled. Not the hope you were consciously holding, not the simple hope that they would change, but the deeper hope underneath that one. The hope that love is enough, that patience is enough. That if you understand someone fully enough and love them generously enough and create safe enough conditions, human connection can overcome any psychological obstacle. That hope is one of the most fundamental beliefs most people carry about love and about human potential. And Jung's warning doesn't just challenge it in the specific case of the person you've been loving. It challenges it as a universal principle. That's a significant loss. It deserves to be grieved as a significant loss. The grief isn't weakness. It's not evidence that you haven't really accepted what Jung's framework is telling you. It's the appropriate response to losing something you genuinely believed, a belief about love's power that served you in many ways, even as it kept you waiting in this particular situation. Give yourself permission to grieve it. Not indefinitely, but genuinely. Because rushing past it into performed acceptance means you're carrying the unprocessed version of it into whatever comes next. What you do with the grief. Here's the thing about this particular grief that distinguishes it from other kinds. It has a specific function if you let it complete itself, rather than interrupting it or bypassing it. The grief of dismantled hope, when it runs its full course, rather than getting frozen into bitterness or rushed into false resolution, produces something that other grief doesn't produce as reliably. It produces discernment, the specific, hard-earned, experience-based capacity to see people accurately, to assess what someone is actually capable of, rather than what you hope they're capable of, to distinguish between someone who is struggling toward genuine change and someone whose patterns are structural rather than behavioral, to recognize early, not after years, not after you've organized your life around their potential, what you're actually working with. This discernment is not cynicism. I want to be precise about this because the line matters, and crossing it in the wrong direction would be a different kind of loss. Cynicism says, no one can change, no one can be trusted. Genuine intimacy is a fantasy, and protection is wisdom. Discernment says, some people can change and some people's structures don't permit the kind of change that intimate partnership requires. And I've developed enough clarity to tell the difference earlier than I used to be able to. Cynicism closes, discernment selects. And what you're developing through this experience, if you let the grief do its work and arrive at the clarity on the other side, is the second thing. The discernment shows up practically in how you read early relationship dynamics going forward, in how you distinguish between someone who is private and someone who is unavailable, between someone who needs time to trust and someone whose patterns mean that trust, once extended, will still not produce the vulnerability and presence that relationship requires, between someone who is working on themselves in ways that are actually producing behavioral change and someone who has developed the ability to discuss their work without the work producing any meaningful results in how they actually show up. These distinctions are learnable. They're not mystical or inaccessible. They're pattern recognition, developed through experience and sharpened through honest reflection on what the experience actually taught you. And the experience you've been through, however painful, however long, however costly, has given you access to this discernment in a way that easier experiences couldn't have. The cost was real. The thing you've developed through paying it is also real. Both things are true simultaneously. The question that actually matters now, there's a question underneath everything in this video that I want to name directly, because I think it's the question most people watching are actually asking, even though they're not always asking it consciously. Not, can the avoidant change? You have an answer to that now, or at least a clearer framework for assessing it honestly than you had before. The question is this: given everything you now know, given Jung's framework, given the honest assessment of the patterns you've observed over time, given the clarity that accurate information provides about what you're actually working with, what do you want your life to look like? Not what do you want them to do? Not what would need to happen for the relationship to become what you need it to be. What do you want your life to look like? This question is harder than it sounds, because most people who've been in this dynamic have spent so long organizing their attention and their hope around the other person's potential that they've lost clear contact with their own desires for their own life. You've been asking, what does this person need in order to change? For so long that what do I actually want has become almost unfamiliar. The answer isn't immediately available because the question hasn't been the primary question for a significant period of time. So ask it now. Seriously, not rhetorically. What do you actually want? Not from them, from your life, from partnership, from the experience of being in intimate relationship with another person. What does that look like when it's working? What does it feel like when the person you're with has the capacity to actually show up for it? Some people, when they ask this question honestly, discover that what they want is achievable, that the relationship they need is available from someone capable of providing it, and that the primary obstacle to having it has been continued investment in someone who cannot. Some people discover that the years spent in this dynamic have left them with work to do on their own relationship with intimacy and vulnerability, that being with someone unavailable for so long has created its own adaptations that they'll need to address before they can fully receive what a genuinely available person would offer. Some people discover both. Whatever you discover is useful, because whatever you find when you ask that question, honestly, is the actual starting point for whatever comes next, not a projected starting point based on hoped-for change in someone else. Your actual present, honest starting point, which is always the only real place anything can begin. The kind of person Jung's framework points you toward. I want to be specific about what genuine emotional availability actually looks like, not in the abstract, but in the specific behavioral patterns that distinguish someone capable of real partnership from someone performing the appearance of it. Because one of the risks of spending significant time with someone whose defensive structure creates the particular texture of avoidant relationship is that you recalibrate. Your baseline for what relationship feels like shifts. The anxious monitoring becomes normal. The careful management of your own needs to avoid triggering withdrawal becomes normal. The interpretation of minimal engagement as meaningful gesture becomes normal. The hope that this time will be different, becoming the organizing emotional experience of the relationship. That becomes normal. And when something genuinely different arrives, it can initially feel wrong, too easy, suspiciously comfortable. The absence of the familiar anxiety can feel like absence of depth rather than presence of safety. So let me describe what you're actually moving toward, so you can recognize it when it arrives without mistaking its unfamiliarity for insufficiency. Genuine emotional availability looks like someone whose presence doesn't require management. You don't monitor their emotional state to calibrate how much of yourself is currently safe to show. You don't adjust what you say or how you say it based on whether they seem like they can handle it today. You don't track response times or interpret silences or read distance into ordinary human unavailability. Their presence is simply present, not managed, not performed, not strategically deployed, just there. It looks like someone who moves toward you when things get difficult rather than away. This is perhaps the most specific and reliable indicator. When a conversation gets hard, when vulnerability is actually required, when the relationship reaches the places where genuine emotional presence is necessary, someone with actual capacity moves toward those places rather than away from them. Not effortlessly, not without discomfort, but toward, with a consistent direction that you can observe and rely on over time. It looks like reciprocity that doesn't require management. You don't have to create conditions for their investment. You don't have to strategically withdraw your own to prompt them to give more. You don't have to calibrate your availability to manage theirs. They're invested, visibly, consistently, in the ordinary ways that real investment looks when it doesn't need to be coaxed or maintained or carefully protected from triggering their retreat. It looks like someone who can hear that they've hurt you and stay in the conversation, who can be told they've done something that caused pain and respond with genuine accountability rather than defensiveness or deflection or the sophisticated psychological vocabulary that sounds like self-awareness but functions as redirection, who can sit with having disappointed you without that sitting becoming a reason to create distance. These things sound simple. They are not simple. They require real psychological development, real capacity, real earned ability to be present under pressure. But they're available. They exist in real people who have done real work and who are genuinely capable of the partnership you've been trying to build with someone who couldn't build it. The avoidant with a permanent defensive structure cannot consistently offer these things, not because they don't want to, because their psychological organization doesn't permit it. What they can offer is the appearance of some of these things in the periods when the relationship doesn't require too much, and the withdrawal from all of them when it does. The consistency of the withdrawal is the data. Jung's framework helps you read it accurately, rather than as something you need to find a way to prevent. The last thing worth saying about Jung and about you. Jung spent his life studying the places where human psychology reaches its limits. Not because he was a pessimist. He was, if anything, one of the most profound believers in human potential in the history of psychology. but because he understood that genuine belief in human potential requires honest acknowledgement of human limitation, that you cannot help someone reach their actual potential by pretending their limitations don't exist. That accurate assessment of where someone is and what they're genuinely capable of is always more loving than false encouragement toward a transformation that their structure doesn't permit. This is the final thing Jung's warning offers you. Not just clarity about the avoidant, clarity about what real love actually requires. Real love, the kind that serves the person you're loving, rather than the hope you have for them, sometimes means acknowledging that what they need is beyond what you can provide or what the relationship can produce, that the most loving thing available is sometimes the honest acknowledgement that this particular connection cannot become what both people need it to become, that staying, in some circumstances, isn't love. It's the inability to accept that love has limits, that reality imposes regardless of how much you feel or how hard you try. Jung accepted limitation without losing belief in possibility. He grieved what couldn't be changed without abandoning faith in what could. He held the specific, difficult, mature understanding that accurate assessment of limits is not the opposite of hope. It's what allows hope to be directed toward what's actually possible rather than dissipated in pursuit of what isn't. That's what you're arriving at now. Not the end of belief in love or connection or genuine partnership. The beginning of believing in them accurately, of directing your extraordinary capacity for love, which this experience has tested and proven, towards someone whose capacity can meet yours, of building something real with someone who is actually capable of building. Jung warned about permanent defensive structures so that people would stop sacrificing themselves on the altar of impossible transformation, so that the people loving avoidance would have permission to see clearly, decide clearly, and move toward lives that don't require them to love someone through limitations that will never change into something else. You have that permission now. You've always had it. Jung just gave you the framework to finally use it.